I'm Jessica Philippe. I'm the Member Engagement Librarian at the South Central Regional Library Council. Thanks for joining today's program on finding hidden links in the Underground Railroad in Oneonta and Norwich, New York. This webinar is paid for by a grant from Humanities New York. There will be 2 more webinars on the Underground Railroad in our region, and a forthcoming traveling exhibit and live guide as part of this grant. We're using Zoom webinar today, so your mics and cameras are off, but you are welcome to post questions and comments to the chat. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Harry Bradshaw Matthews. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to be sharing some ideas about identifying sites of the Underground Railroad that are commonly not known. So we'll start off today with the idea that in 1857, I learned that Frederick Douglass was scheduled to come to Oneonta the day after the newspaper article. But in the article itself, it did not indicate who was sponsoring him or where he would be speaking, although the editor of the newspaper indicated people to come out in mass, which was kind of strange. Then in 1864, the same newspaper reported that a mother, 6 children, and a half-sister had escaped to Oneonta. They didn't indicate where they escaped to in Oneonta or who the hosts were. So it became very intriguing to me that, as many historians have indicated, the Underground Railroad was a very secretive operation. But I was curious as to how I could identify those persons who were helping. Now, to understand the Underground Railroad, you first have to realize that the Underground Railroad is not simply physical sites. There are a number of different terms or roles designated as part of the Underground Railroad. And here I'm showing you some of the terms that were associated with the Underground Railroad that you will notice is very, very similar to terms associated to the regular railroad, but they had different definitions. So a conductor was a person leading the escaped slave. A station was a place where an escaped slave was taken. A station agent was a person receiving the runaway slave. The freight was the enslaved person, him or herself. Freight agent was a person receiving him. Now, this is where the Underground Railroad becomes really secretive from others. The term hardware equaled a male in transit. Dry goods was a female in transport. So if I was to indicate to you, I have some dry goods coming in at 6 o'clock today, I would mean that one or more females was in transport. Then there was a vigilance committee. Now, the vigilance committee were individuals who were very strongly involved in the Underground Railroad, mainly in larger areas where they have considerable support. And members of the vigilance committee would tell you publicly that they would assist any runaway and they would dare someone to come after them. That's kind of bold. And then there was the term, 2 other terms. One of the terms was financial contributor. Now, financial contributor was extremely important because he or she provided funds to assist those who are assisting runaways. So if there were legal cases or anything of that nature, they were considered part of the Underground Railroad as well. And then there's the legal defenders, and those were the individuals who provided assistance to those who were brought under charges, whether they be a conductor, whether they be a freedom seeker. Well, this story begins in 1822. Now, I wanted to share with you the idea that there are different techniques that you can use to uncover an Underground Railroad story. One of those starting points is trying to learn the oral history of the folklore in the local area. In this particular case, Ira Emmons had a stone house in 1822 outside of Oneonta, And there was this frequent story told that there were enslaved persons in Ira Emmons' stone house. Well, one of the first things that I did was look for secondary sources before trying to find the original documents to verify otherwise. So I did find two publications that are well respected in this area for telling the story of the Underground Railroad. And I learned from Eugene Milliner that they were two Black persons in the household. They were two children. They were not slaves. They were indentures, which meant that Ira went to Maryland and reached an agreement with a father to bring back to New York his 6-year-old son, who would be treated as an indenture during his youth. And then in the second case, his 5-year-old sister, Mary, also joined. So yes, there were two Black persons recorded who was in the household, but they were not slaves. So to get closer into this adventure, it's important to understand that there are different sources that you can use, even if you are a small community that's not commonly listed in Underground Railroad publications, like William Still's publication on the Underground Railroad. In this particular case, the first thing I did, I found out that there was an Oneonta or Otsego County Anti-Slavery Society that was founded in 1836. Now, this follows the New York State Anti-Slavery Society that a year or so was established by Garrett Smith and others based in Utica. At least the newspaper, their communication organ was based in Utica, and it was known as the Friend of Man. Now, the first thing to understand in this particular case is that there were a series of newspaper, anti-slavery, abolitionist newspapers that identified some of the local communities. And in this particular case, where I'm located in Otsego County, the Friend of Man was a very important newspaper. Now, the other important thing about this 1836 article is that it indicated that Gilbertsville would be the meeting of the next, would be the site for the next meeting, which was important. I already knew the members of the Otsego County Anti-Slavery Society, and they're listed here. Now, this is very important because if you can actually identify any one of these persons in a document, it may lead you further into exploration of what was occurring in that particular organization. Then a surprising thing occurred because I was in the habit of looking for secondary sources first, and I used the web to do that, but I also looked for some of the primary newspapers. I was familiar with Gettysburg, having been a dean at Gettysburg College, and I came across Gettysburg Star and Banner, which in 1837, there was an article that indicated that there was this radical Lutheran abolitionist group organized in Otsego County. The organization was known as the Frankian Synod. 4 or 5 members decided that the Hartwick Synod did not have a strong stance against slavery, so they broke off and formed a new organization. The Reverend John Lawyer was the leader, and his second in command was the Reverend Nicholas Van Alstyne. This was very important. They ended up finalizing their new organization in Madison County, which is bordering Otsego County, but they then maintained a close relationship with the Hartwick Lutheran Seminary and Academy. Now, the Hartwick Lutheran Seminary and Academy is the oldest Lutheran seminary in the United States, founded in 1797. So there was an important place for this new group to have closer ties to. Then I continued my search, looking for books and so on, and I found a particular book written in 1856, The Fugitive or the Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada by Benjamin Drew. And what was important about this particular publication is that Drew interviewed a number of freedom seekers who ended up in Canada, and then he told their stories from their voices, about 100 of them. One of the ones that was interviewed was the Reverend Alexander Hemsley. Now, Alexander Hemsley, before as a freedom seeker, used the name Nathan Meade. So you'll see those two names together. But at any rate, Alexander Hemsley escaped from slavery in Maryland in 1836. He made his way to New Jersey. He settled in pretty comfortably. He got married, had a couple of children. And then 2 or 3 slave catchers came to the area, and one of them spotted Alexander Hemsley. And they then became determined to capture him and take him back into slavery. Well, there was a court case, and Alexander Hemsley received a temporary reprieve, but his friends advised him to run because they were going to, slave catchers were going to be after him. And he did. And he ran mostly on foot, 200 or so miles, and he made his way to a sign that said Otsego County, New York. And he fainted. He was recovered by some local citizens and then taken care of while his wife and children were transported to Otsego County. Then we go to another newspaper. Now, there are a number of anti-slavery abolitionist newspapers during the time period, and each one of those newspapers served an important point, particularly in the location where it's published, but then it has stories that cover a broader area, both statewide and regionally. Well, there was one newspaper called the Colored American, one of the earliest newspapers in the African-American newspapers in the United States. And in this particular case, there was an individual who went around the state assessing what were the conditions, what were the attitudes of local people about the slavery system. And they recorded their responses identified with 10 different counties. Surprisingly, one of those counties was Otsego County. And there, in quotes, was the statement, there are also hearts that feel and tongues that speak and hands that act in behalf of the oppressed. Well, I pondered over this sentence for a number of months and so on, and I finally came to the conclusion that that statement was in code. So I broke it down. And I found that there are also hearts that feel equal anti-slavery sentiments, and tongues that speak equal abolitionist actions, lectures, pamphlets, sermons, so on, and hands that act in behalf of the oppressed was the Underground Railroad. So in this particular case, it was being pointed out that there were individuals in all 3 categories in Otsego County. But then I became curious, and I accepted the idea of the different terminology associated with the Underground Railroad, but then I added 2 other points. And one was the Freedom Journey also included the United States Colored Troops Equal Fight for Freedom, where the men, over 200,000 Black men, fought for their own freedom, and then self-help agencies equal lifting up the race. And that would be churches and other organizations that would provide aid. So that was Otsego County, but I became interested in Delaware County, which is right next door to Otsego, and it too is listed in this discussion of the 10 localities. So the Friend of Man, now I depended upon the Friend of Man quite a bit because it's located in Utica, not far from Oneonta or Otsego County. So whenever I was pursuing something, I would go and check to see if there was any reference to the person or the location I was looking for. And in this particular case, there was. We learned that Delaware County Anti-Slavery Society in 1838 was holding its second annual meeting, which meant it was established in 1837. But most interesting was it identified where the county meeting was held, which was a Presbyterian church in Delhi, which is the capital of the county seat. And then there were individuals within Delaware County from localities, hamlets, and townships associated as representing those particular areas at this convention, at this county convention. And it was intriguing to me because there was a number of local communities that I was familiar with, and each one had a person identified with that particular town or lordship. For instance, I'm living close to Franklin, the village of Franklin, outside of Oneonta, and there was a E. McCall who represented Franklin. And then nearby on the other end of Oneonta, there was Davenport, and here again, we have a Deacon Metcalf, and so on. So this is extremely important because it shows who some of the leaders in the community were during this time period. Now, going to a secondary source, The History of Delaware County by W.W. Monzo, I learned that in Franklin, in 1836, there existed an institution known as the Delaware Literary Institute, a private high school under the tutelage governance of the Presbyterians in Delaware County. And I learned that in 1836, there was an Isaac Platt who was the president of the board of trustees for the Institute. And he gave up his office, and the office went to E. McCall. Well, I learned that both E. McCall and Platt both were supporters of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. To me, that was intriguing because it indicated to me here was a literary institute, academic institution that was associated with the anti-slavery movement. And now I have the names of two persons. So I continued my search for secondary sources, and I found a second book, Franklin Law, in which the author identified that there was a father and a son who had helped an escaped slave. They were slave station masters in 1858. Okay, so 1858 and 1857. Frederick Douglass, 1857 in Oneonta, and station masters transporting someone in Franklin County or from Franklin County, 1858. So it gave me the idea, these two communities are so close together, they're probably working in league with each other. So I kept my search on, and I went back to the Friend of Man. In 1840, I learned that, yes, they were the names of individuals who made donations to the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. And frequently, a listing would appear of receipts received showing who was making donations and what their names were, and frequently where they were located at. Well, one person or group of persons actually caught my attention was for the village of Harpersfield, or the town of Harpersfield. And the surname of the individuals was Penfield. And there were several of them who had made donations. So I became quite interested in that. And I found out, going back to an earlier source, that Ebenezer Penfield had John Platt and McCall as members of the trustees of the Delaware Literary Institute. So this is telling me, okay, there's a chain of communities linking together. And once again, this institute pops up. So I decided, okay, let's look on the other side of Otsego County and see what was happening. And I learned that there was a Reverend Henry Snyder in Shenango County, Norwich is one of the big sites, who was one of the founders of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. So now I had a name for Shenango County too. So now I'm starting to see individuals associated in communities near Oneonta in Otsego County. Continuing my search, I went back to the Friends of Man, and I located that in Shenango County. There was a planned meeting to take place in 1838. And it was really interesting to me because the location of the meeting was at two very small communities, Pitcher and Oxford. And Pitcher is like a hamlet outside of Norwich. So this is telling me, okay, something's going on around Norwich as well. But also important was that this particular article provided me with the names of the president of the Shenango County Anti-Slavery Society, who was James Thompson, and also the secretary, James Kershaw. So those names gave me insight as well. Then I found the name of a donor, J. Pendleton from Oxford. So things are looking pretty good at this point in terms of connecting possible routes the different enslaved persons was taking as freedom seekers. Okay, so then I come to Oneonta. Now, a primary source for information exists at Syracuse University. It's the Garrett Smith papers. Now, Garrett Smith was a major donor, financer of the Underground Railroad, of the whole anti-slavery movement, very wealthy, extremely wealthy. So it was a tendency of people to contact Garrett Smith if they were in need of some type of assistance. And that's what occurred in 1839. The Presbyterian Church in Oneonta, under the Reverend J.W. Paddock, sent a letter to Garrett Smith asking for assistance to help with some repairs in the Presbyterian Church in Oneonta. Well, also signing on the letter were deacons, and when you look at the names of those individuals, they were very prominent persons in this new community, relatively new community. So that made me aware, okay, so Presbyterians were functioning as major anti-slavery advocates in Franklin and throughout Delaware County. Well, why not Otsego County, where Oneonta is located? So now I had a name, Reverend Joseph W. Patton. Well, one of the things that was intriguing to me was that part of the folklore in Oneonta was that the Presbyterian Church, First Presbyterian Church, resided next to a house, or vice versa, and that there was a tunnel that connected the two to help freedom seekers make their way up from the Susquehanna River into these hiding places. So that was intriguing. Well, I went back to the Friends of Man, which is now one of my major sources, primary sources for finding information. And there was a listing of receipts in 1841. And Otsego County was pretty well represented with donations from Cherry Valley, Cooperstown, Milford. And then there was Oneonta, J.W. Paddock. So what made me very excited was that now there was a specific connection of Oneonta with the anti-slavery movement, the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, and the connection with Garrett Smith. Jumping ahead and looking at other primary sources, and I remember the Frankians. Now, the Frankians was the most fierce Lutheran abolitionist organization in the United States. They were either hated or they were loved. And in this particular case, in 1841, the Journal of the Frankian Descendant, 1841, details some information about Oneonta, the district of Oneonta. Oneonta in South Worcester had 80 members. So they were a congregation. There was a congregation of Frankians in Oneonta. Now, what that tells me is that there were some major players in Oneonta dealing with both the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad. And one of the intriguing notes that was in this particular reference was the mention that there were free will Baptists who were joining the Frankians in building a church together. Okay, that's a federation, which means that there were individuals from different denominations who were coming together for a common cause. And now in this particular case, the Free Will Baptists and the Frankians are building their own sanctuary for the use of both congregations. That was very important. It was very important because the Frankians was a fierce abolitionist group, and here in Oneonta was a congregation of the Frankians. And likewise, the Free Will was very well known as being anti-slavery. So 6 years later, in another issue of the journal, the Franklin's Journal, I find that things were very similar. And in this case, the Oneonta congregation was listed as existing on the Oneonta Plains, which is an area around Oneonta and West Oneonta, which is together. And it indicated that it was 35 members. Well, here I learned that John Lawyer's very close ally, Nathaniel Van Alstyne, he was associated with this church as well. So this is really interesting. He may have been traveling back and forth, and in this case, he was attending the meeting in Oneonta. But this is very significant because it shows that Oneonta, once again, is a player. Well, it's very important to point out at this point, so we don't get lost. There were African Americans in this area who were also engaged in the anti-slavery movement. And Otsego County had a group who attended the New York State Convention of Colored Inhabitants in 1840. And I had the name of a couple individuals to provide further identity. But that was very important to know. It's important to know because most of the African Americans who existed in Otsego County lived near Cooperstown and local regions there rather than Oneonta. Oneonta really did not have a Black community. So this is intriguing too, that Oneonta was actively involved. The white citizenry was heavily involved, but nevertheless they were communicating. In 1841, there's a notation about a Reverend Paul. Daniel Alexander Payne, Daniel Alexander Payne. Daniel Alexander Payne was an African American who was educated at the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary under the tutelage of Samuel Simon Schmucker. And he was there between 1835 and 1837. Well, after Payne completed his studies, he was ordained by the Frankians. So there is a communication channel open between Otsego County and Adams County, where Gettysburg is located, among the Lutherans. Most people know Gettysburg as a major site dealing with the Civil War, but Gettysburg was a major site of the Underground Railroad. And the Macy-Dixie line was nearby, and there would be individuals, freedom seekers, who would cross that line into getting to Gettysburg, and then they were sent either to Harrisburg or York, Pennsylvania for transport to New York City, or Philadelphia, New York City. But anyway, they would arrive in New York, and then they would be assisted in being dispersed in different areas. And one of those areas we will learn was Norwich, New York. Okay, so important thing about Payne was, although he was ordained by the Frankians, there was no church available for him at that time. So he aligned himself with Presbyterians, who was organizing a church in Troy, New York. That's where they function a lot of their business from, on the 2nd Street Presbyterian Church. But In my information, my searches, I found out that Payne was joining some of the leading advocates within the African American population. Not only were they active in the Underground Railroad, these were the guys, and there were a few women, but these were the guys primarily who defined an ethnic identity for people of African descent. And it was known as colored Americans of the typical branch of the Ethiopian race. And the important thing was these individuals who was making this identity clear were educated in some of the leading institutions in the United States and abroad, even during the slavery period. Now, back to the Hartwick Seminary and Academy, founded in 1797. That was where Reverend John Lawyer and others were associated with. Well, one of the students who attended the Hartwick Seminary and Academy was Isaac Newton Arnold. He was born in Hartwick, New York, and then he was educated at the Hartwick Seminary and Academy. By 1830s or 36, around that time, he left Otsego County and he went to Chicago, Illinois, and it was there that he became very close friends with Abraham Lincoln. Well, Isaac Newton Arnold was already a confirmed member of the Underground Railroad, providing legal assistance to those in need. And he returned to New York in 1848. Very important date. 1848 was when there was a coming together of the Liberty Party and the National Free Soil Party in a convention held in Buffalo, New York. And it was almost as if these individuals who had convened had now organized themselves into an army. They were ready to fight head on against those that were supporting the slavery system. Well, really interesting to me was that in a newspaper known as the National Era, it was located in Washington, D.C. in 1848. In that newspaper, I learned of Elijah Reed Ford, who's a district elector from Otsego County, New York, connected with the Free Soil Party and so on. Actually, he lived in Oneonta. He was one of the prominent leaders in Oneonta. So now I see where the strong anti-slavery attitude was coming from, at least in Oneonta, because Elijah Reed Ford was a very powerful man with wealth, and he was a free will Baptist. Okay, so he attended the meeting in 1848 as well. Now, this 1848 meeting, I keep repeating, was extremely important. Extremely important. And they had a motto of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Well, there was another person who I've already mentioned, Reverend John Lawyer, who was also a member of this group. And he had his own newspaper, the Shenango Free Democrat, operating out of Norwich, New York, and Bainbridge, which are both in Shenango County. Well, in Lawyer's case, Lawyer had the same motto, but he added on one additional point: no slave territories. So he was not playing either. This is a very radical group, and they were doing their thing. Well, let's get back to Frederick Douglass for a minute. Frederick Douglass came to Oneonta in 1857. It was to give a speech. So he's very important to this discussion dealing with Oneonta too. Well, he published a book, My Bondage and Freedom, in 1855. And in that book, he talks about the 1848 convention. And he indicates that in 1848, it was my privilege to, and in some measure, to participate in the famous Free Soil Convention held in Buffalo, New York. It was a vast and variegated assemblage comprised of persons from all sections of the North, and may be said to have formed a new departure in the history of forces organized to resist the growing and aggressive demands of slavery and the slave power. He affirmed that that meeting had now set up a network of individuals who work very, very closely with each other. Well, then we go to 1850 census. Remember Eliakim Reed Ford? Well, Eliakim Reed Ford, who we just talked about, was married to Harriet Emmons Ford. Now, Harriet Emmons was Ira Emmons' daughter. In 1821, 1822, we learned about these two young children being, Black children being in this household. Well, their last name was Durham. Well, in 1850, there was a Fanny Durham living with Eliakim Reed Ford and his wife in Oneonta. She was Black, she was 29 years old, and she was born in Maryland. And if you look at her age in 1850, she would have been born in 1821 or so. In other words, she was an infant and was probably the baby sister of the two young children who was in Eliakim in Emmons' household in 1822. Very important. Here we see an illustration of beautiful home of Eliakim Reed Ford, classic, and it was a station of the Underground Railroad. Ed Moore, in his Old Oneonta 1964, quoted that there's definite proof that the local Underground Railroad station was the Ford Stone Mansion, Main Street, Oneonta. My records just went to affirm that thought. So we know now that Eliakim Reed Ford was part of the Free Soil Party. But then there was another individual who I uncovered, and his name was Robert S. Cook from West Oneonta, which is Oneonta. And Cook's connection to the Underground Railroad in 1853. He made a donation to the bail fund to help those who were helping freedom seekers, whether they were lawyers or the freedom seekers themselves. He made a donation. So he's a financial contributor to the Underground Railroad, and his contribution is identified in Frederick Douglass's newspaper in 1853. Next to the house, Eliakim Reed Ford's house, is the tombstone for Robert S. Cook. So clearly, there's no question that Frederick Douglass knew that something was happening in Oneonta. He probably knew exactly what was happening in Oneonta, a very secretive station of the Underground Railroad. Okay, why did Frederick Douglass come to Oneonta in 1857? Well, many are aware of the famous Dred Scott case in which enslaved persons was removed from a slave state to a free state, and then they went back to the slave state, and Dred Scott sued for his freedom because he said that he had been under free, so that should have made him free. Well, here's Otsego County. Judge Samuel Nelson for Cooperstown was a member of the United States Supreme Court that was rendering a decision in this particular case. Now, Judge Nelson was leaning towards state rights, as had occurred in New York, the right of each state to determine what was going to be happening with slavery in their states. But the Supreme Court Justice Taney, took over the case, and he went beyond what was being called for in the case. And he said there was not a single virtue possessed by a Black man that was worthy of respect by a white man. He made it clear that slavery was an institution within the United States. It was supported by the judicial system, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. It was institutionalized. Well, the decision was made on March 6, 1857. And soon after that, Frederick Douglass went on a major tour condemning this decision. And he ended up in Oneonta in October 1857. I learned of the visit of Frederick Douglass from the local news newspaper, the Oneonta Herald, of October 28, 1857, in which it was indicated that Frederick Douglass would be speaking there the next day. And local townspeople were encouraged to come out in mass. Okay. But the location of the meeting was not identified. The host of the gathering was not identified. This pretty much goes along with the general notion that the Underground Railroad was a very secretive operation. But interesting enough, in the article was also words from the village of Franklin. And they were very encouraging of Frederick Douglass. They praised him for what he was doing and so on. So now I say, there is a connection between Oneonta and Franklin. Even though they're in different counties, they're still located very close to each other geographically. And they're working together. Well, 1857 came and went. Then in 1858, an interesting thing occurred. There's a newspaper in Franklin, the village of Franklin, in which they're talking about the progressive development of Frederick Douglass's paper, and that it was entering its 12th volume, and that it was able, fearless, and deserves large support. So there is clearly a strong contingent of citizens in Franklin, around Franklin, New York, who was strongly anti-slavery and connected to the Underground Railroad. So then I decided to continue pursuing my goal, and I noticed that in the centennial publication for the city of Oneonta, 1848 to 1948, there was a one-liner in this publication, and it said 1860, Underground Railroad, a family of 8 Negroes were passed through this place July 25th on the Underground Railroad towards Canada by some philanthropic citizens. Okay, now it's getting really clear that Oneonta was a station of the Underground Railroad. So I went searching for further proof. That was the booklet was considered a secondary source. I wanted primary material affirming that, and I found it. It was located in the Oneonta Herald, August 1st, 1860, and it talks about the day that the group came, a few days that they remained. It talked about they came from Virginia, and they were well provided for by benevolent citizens of humanity who were in Oneonta. And after being there for a few days, they continued their journey towards Canada, rejoicing and leaving their blessing on the good people of Oneonta. But something intriguing caught my attention, and that was a further statement. What an idea. Persons escaping from a country which boasts of freedom and free institutions to a land ruled by a monarch in order that they may enjoy freedom. Shame to America. The voice of Oneonta was clear. It wasn't well known. It was more in a secretive mode, dealing known mainly in some of the local circles, but it was involved in the process. So the Underground Railroad came, it all led to the Civil War. We end up with 200,000 black men and 7,000 white officers jointly being referred to as the United States Colored Troops, comprised of various regiments. And then there were several regiments that were state designated, like the Massachusetts 54th, the Connecticut 29th, the Rhode Island 14th, and so on. But they were all in league with each other. So this is very important now because there were a number of soldiers, African-American and white soldiers, who were members of the USCT. One of the most prominent was the gentleman, Stephen Swales. He was associated with both Cooperstown, where he worked, and Elmira, where his wife's family resided. Well, Swales became the first enlisted soldier to be appointed, black soldier to be appointed as an officer lieutenant during the Civil War. But then we jump to Norwich, and remember John Lawyer? Oh, certainly you remember John Lawyer. John Lawyer was in Norwich, but there was also William B. Guernsey in Norwich. And William B. Guernsey became one of the major officers of the Fighting 26 USCT, well-known regiment for their valor. And Guernsey made it through the ranks, and when he finally retired in 1865, he retired at the rank of colonel. Now, one of the things that I like about this story about the 26 is that I learned that when Union soldiers went to Galveston, Texas, dealing with the Juneteenth issue and so on, well, the 26th Regiment made it there before the regiments that was designated to be there. And the way that the 26th arrived early was that that regiment and a couple other UST regiments were being stationed at the border, Texas border, to prevent any foreigners from entering, taking advantage of the conflict, the Civil War, and the consequences of the Civil War. So they were there before the great celebration occurred about Juneteenth. We had men from New York, and not only New York. The 26th Regiment had men from throughout the Caribbean, and there were even a few African Americans or Black folks who were from Europe, who were a member of that famous regiment. Well, Guernsey's family house ended up as the major library in Norwich. And there's a beautiful painting of him on the wall. Okay, talking about a few of the other soldiers connected to the Underground Railroad, we refer to William Street. William Street escaped from Hartwick County, Maryland. He made his way to Norwich. And when the war broke out, he enlisted in the war. And he fought along with Guernsey. So he was very fun. And after the war, he returned back to Shenango County, first to Norwich, and then he relocated to Sidney, New York, which is on the border of Shenango and Otsego County, Delaware and Otsego County. They all right there, kind of like a triangle. So that was very important. So I was able to get some of his papers. When he died, his obituary told his story. He's buried in Sydney at the community cemetery, and he was buried with full military honors. Well, there were others from the 26th as well, from different communities. Burlington, these are small communities in the area. And then there was from Delhi. Delhi also has a story similar to Norwich in terms of having a small Black community during the anti-slavery movement. But the individuals in these adjoining communities, they were interacting regardless of geographic location. Boundaries didn't mean anything to them. They were finding common ground among themselves. One of the other stories is one of Benjamin Tillett, who's also buried in Norwich. Norwich has a phenomenal history in terms of burials of the USCT soldiers. It should be a national recognized site for preservation. Well, Tillett, he ended up with the Rhode Island 11th, 14th. They use both of those designations. But he too had escaped and ended up he escaped from North Carolina and ended up in Norwich, and then he enlisted in war. So this area definitely serves as a supporting area for the advancement of these people. Well, this is just a few of the publications that started this effort. These are writings that I have done. Voices of the Front Line, also now Freedom Journey to New York, has the full roster of the 26 USCT, which is the first time these soldiers have been identified by in a publication. by home, and in some cases by family relations. And that fact was documented in a proclamation issued by Governor Pataki in 1997, certifying that the effort that we were currently involved in Oneonta, Delaware, and Otsego County was indeed historic. And we conclude this program with the Emancipation Ball in 1872. It was held in Otsego County, but organizers were from Binghamton, they were from Shenango County, they were from Otsego County. So they were coming together. They crossed lines, but it was very important that they were having a remembrance. And then in 1997, the remembrance was recalled again of the Emancipation Ball at Hartwick College. And it continued as an annual event for over 10 years, in which we remembered this freedom journey. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for sharing your research with us.
You're quite welcome. It was and continued to be a journey, and it wasn't done overnight. It took years to piece these little bits and pieces of information together to confirm what we were talking about today.
I believe it. I mean, as I mentioned to you before, it's basically detective work that you've done here.
Oh, it absolutely is. And you never know when you're going to find something or where you're going to find it. So you just have to be diligent and work through the process and see where it takes you. But as of now, we know that Oneonta was a station of the Underground Railroad, and that there was a reason why Frederick Douglass came to Oneonta.
Mm-hmm. I do want to mention that we'll be sharing a link to the recording and a copy of the slides with everybody who registered for today's program. And now we can do a little bit of a Q&A. If there's any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. So we did have one question earlier on. This was from one of your earliest slides. And they were asking, you were mentioning a synod in Madison County. And did you know where in Madison County that took place?
Yes, it's located in, I had it on there. It's a small community. I'll pick it up for you. Here, this is the slide that we're talking about. It was at Ford's Bush, Fordsbush, Lutheran Schoolhouse Chapel. So there's a Lutheran church and a schoolhouse there, and that's where the organizing meeting of the Franklins took place. And then from there, they were dispersed. But the Franklins they continued association with the Hartwick Lutheran Seminary and Academy. That was never broken off. So that's where it occurred.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about Frederick Douglass speaking in Norwich and Greene, New York?
I don't. I have not located information about Norwich. If he spoke in Norwich, that's a new one for me, which is good. And similarly with Greene. Frederick Douglass was very particular about where he spoke. I know he spoke in Canandaigua. There's a couple speeches he gave at different places that's remembered over and over and over and over again. So if someone has evidence that he spoke in Greene and Norwich, or even like a newspaper indicating he was going to be speaking, I would love to be informed of that information. My years dealing with this was with the United States Cultural Institute for Local History and Family Research, which is designated by the National Park Service as an affiliate of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And so whatever I come up with or share has to be fully documented. There have to be sources to substantiate what I'm saying. So, and that's why I'm saying that if Frederick Douglass did speak in Greene, or Norwich. That's very important. It's going to be very, very important to the history of those two communities.
Well, Henry mentions in the chat that he spoke there several times, including in 1866, and he has the newspaper references. So, Mr. Matthews, do you mind if I share your email with the people who registered today, and maybe we can put you two in touch?
Sure, sure. Now, there are a number of anti-slavery newspapers, and it's very important to, it's easy, just Google. Things have changed a lot these days. Before you had to go find stuff. Now, Google or go online and search anti-slavery newspapers. And a number of them will pop up and they will identify what geographic locations that they were in. But also keep in mind that there were stories that traveled from one newspaper to another. So they are like when we find Eliakim Reed Ford mentioned in Washington, D.C., and he's part of Otsego County, Oneonta specifically. So yeah, those newspapers are extremely important. And for small communities who have never been referenced in the well-known books about the Underground Railroad, like William Still and Siebert's Underground Railroad, these newspapers become very important because they identify local places, small local places. Like Oneonta and Otsego County was not mentioned in either of those books. And then finally, as major points. But finally, after I found out about the Reverend Hemsley, I went back. I had gone through William Still's book before, but I went back and went through every page of the book and found an operative in New Jersey who told the story of the beginning journey of the Reverend in New Jersey. So that was luck. But that's diligence. You just have to continue to do what you do. And then there's the whole issue with other states like Illinois, for instance, in Isaac Newton Arnold. Illinois was very prominent in the anti-slavery movement. And there were a number of chapters. So once again, here's an interconnection between New York and Illinois.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie's asking, do you have records about what happened to the two children living in the Emmons household? How long did Sister Fanny live in Oneonta?
Well, that's a very good question. I lost track of the children. And Durham, Fanny did not show up in the next census, the 1855 New York census. So she either left or she passed away, but I don't know what happened to her. But she's still part of the narrative, a very important part of the narrative, both and as well as the other two children.
Thank you. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, and Mr. Matthews, I don't know if you could see the chat during the presentation, but I'll save it for you because people were very impressed with your research here, and we really thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, I thank you for having me. I think that if it's going to be shared, presentation is going to be shared, hopefully it will be of value to other people as well.
I think it absolutely will. So as we close out the webinar today, there's going to be a brief webinar survey popping up in the browser, and we really appreciate your feedback on that. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.